I should have my guitar. I actually am a lead worshiper at my church back in Pennsylvania, and for several years was also one of the lead worshipers at Hill Country Bible Church in Georgetown, Texas. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm very familiar with this kind of audience. I also, you see the table for Concilium out in the hallway. I also serve on the board of Concilium, and I'm one of their trainers. So I've had the privilege to go and do training for missionaries and for NGO people pretty much all over the world. I mean, in addition to the U.S., I've been able to do, actually last year, which is pretty cool, we did one in Beirut, Lebanon. But I've also been to Kabang, Uganda, and other parts of the world doing missionary training, trying to keep people safe. So I have a real heart for Christian security, for missionary security. Even during my time with the State Department, when I was down in Guatemala in the mid-90s, I was working very closely with a lot of the mission agencies there, trying to keep them safe from the threats that were there. But today I want to talk about terrorism and the threat. Where are we going? Man, this is not working good. Wait, that's on.
Ask Will to do it for you.
Yeah, and you might have to just go to the next slide. It's going to be and one more, please. Okay, so what I want to do now is kind of go through. I've got about an hour. I'm going to try to go through kind of some of these actors and talk about what motivates them, how I see the threat that they pose to our houses of worship here in the U.S. But then I want to take a little bit after that just to kind of look at some of the commonalities, and also really kind of dovetailing on to what Greg was talking about earlier on how having information and knowledge helps us to really prevent things. And that's where I'm trying to get at here is just showing us the behaviors that are involved and steps that we can take then to help protect our people against the threat that these threats pose. Oh, wait, now that went, hold on, what's going on? Oh, okay, I see, wait, so it's the arrow, or it's the button with no arrow. Aha, there we go. All right, first, I mean, and this is the one where everybody gets mostly fired up about the jihadist threat, something that I've actually been working since 1992 against. I went over to Yemen to investigate the first attacks by Al-Qaeda against the United States in Aden and Sana'a, Yemen back then. Then I worked the World Trade Center bombing right after that, right after I came back from Yemen. Of course, it was a couple years before I figured out that those events were linked and that it was the same group, Al-Qaeda. But really right now, the primary actor that we're concerned about when it comes to houses of worship specifically, and specifically here in the U.S., is the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda put out some targeting guidance in 2013 that was their general guidelines for jihad that was signed by Ayman al-Zawahiri, who replaced Osama bin Laden once he was smoked. And basically in these new guidelines for jihad, al-Zawahiri said, listen, it's counterproductive for us to attack houses of worship. And that's one of the things that really caused the split between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda going back into 2005. Al-Qaeda was really upset and concerned by all the attacks that Al-Qaeda in Iraq was conducting against Shias because they thought it was counterproductive. And so basically al-Zawahiri has taken that even a step further. He says we shouldn't do attacks on Christian houses of worship, Jewish houses of worship either, and that goes contrary to some of al-Qaeda's past attacks. I mean, they had attacked churches before. They had attacked synagogues, like the one in Tunis in 2002. But they said in 2013, listen, we need to distinguish ourselves from the Islamic State. No more attacks against houses of worship. So because of that, really, it's primarily the Islamic State we're worried about right now. They are putting out guidance and they're trying to encourage people to attack houses of worship. And we've seen that recently with the church attacks in places like Sri Lanka earlier this spring. We also had one in January over in the Philippines where they had a double tap suicide bombing against a Catholic church over there. Closer to home, how many of you guys heard about the Pittsburgh plot last month? Yeah. That was pretty scary. We had basically a Syrian refugee who had come over to the U.S., went to high school here, I had actually just graduated from high school and was looking at conducting attacks for the Islamic State here. He initially was looking to hit a Shia mosque, or a mosque he thought was Shia, but after he did some surveillance on his target, he decided that, number one, the security was too good. He couldn't get the bomb into the building because they had access controls on the door. They also had CCTV. But then he said he also noticed that there might have been some Sunnis worshiping at the mosque. So he decided that that mosque wasn't his target, and he was instead going to look at a church where there were a bunch of Nigerians worshiping. And he was going to hit them kind of in sympathy with the Islamic State West Africa province in Nigeria. Fortunately, he didn't have a lot in the way of tradecraft. He reached out for help and ended up blundering into an FBI sting operation. So they were able to kind of prevent that attack. But if he had come, number one, if he had decided just to do an attack that was within his means, say something like an armed assault, or if he had just decided to build a primitive, simple bomb, and he could have pulled off that attack if he had acted alone. So we were really close to that happening. Or if he had gotten in touch with a real terrorist facilitator, instead of the FBI agent. So that was a really narrow escape on a bombing attack against the U.S. by the Islamic State. But the good side about that is, for most of their all of since 9/11, all of the jihadists has had problems getting trained terrorist operatives into the U.S. We've seen a couple instances where we've had people that have received bomb training, like Zazi, who was trying to make some TATP to hit the subway in New York. We saw Shahzad, who planted a bomb in Times Square that fortunately didn't go off. So they've been able to get a couple guys into the country, but they haven't been able to get really a large professional cadre into the country like they had for 9/11. So they're struggling to pull that off. That leaves us with kind of like the grassroots operatives. Which is kind of like the do-it-yourself guys. Okay, think globally, act locally. And actually, one of the first grassroots jihadist attacks that we had in the U.S. that wasn't organized, like the 93 Trade Center bombing, basically was these guys working with a professional terrorist organizing them. But one of the first kind of do-it-yourself jihad guys was this guy Carlos Bledsoe, who actually attacked a armed forces recruiting center in Little Rock back in 2009. He had gone over to Yemen, got some firearms training, and one of the targets that he was actually looking at hitting were Baptist churches. His dad was a Baptist pastor. He had been raised Baptist and then converted and became a radical Muslim. But he decided to hit a military target instead of the churches. But still, he was looking at that. So that's been something that's been out there with these grassroots guys for a while. The good news, though, is that usually they lack in tradecraft. They're not very good. And that's in terms of weapons acquisition, bomb making, and most importantly, surveillance, which we're going to talk a little bit about more. But really the key is these guys are bad at surveillance. And the only reason that they're usually not picked up is that people aren't looking for them. Also, I wanted to add in just on this last point. What we're seeing most recently with the Islamic State, the reason that they're trying to get these attacks against houses of worship is not necessarily just to cause casualties and to cause numbers. Think about the 9/11 attacks. What was the real motivation for the 9/11 attacks? Was it just to kill people? Well, fear is one, but what else was, what was bin Laden's big plan? What was he trying to get the U.S. to do? Invade the Muslim world, right? He wanted us there where he could fight us face to face. They wanted us on the ground. And they got it. They had tried it after the 98 East Africa embassy bombings. They tried it with the USS Cole. It didn't work. Finally, they hit us hard enough on 9/11 that we went in and invaded the Muslim world. They got what they wanted. They wanted us there to fight them. And really, a lot of this is what's going on in the Islamic State calculus right now. So they're trying to not only continue to keep us involved and to continue that they see things very dualistically. Okay, it's good and evil, and of course we're the evil, they're the good in their mindset. And they want to continue to propagate this war. And they believe that the more pressure that they can put on and the more that we engage against them, that helps their narrative and helps them recruit young Muslims into their poisonous ideology. And so they want to basically really cause, by attacking churches, they want to then see things like the Christchurch mosque attacks, because that then also furthers their kind of ideology. So they want Christians and others to attack mosques to kind of propagate the ideology. So that's really one of their huge motivators here. White hate. This has been a perpetual problem. Think about the church bombings in the 60s. And of course, they've also hit a number of other types of houses of worship. But they're also a very real concern for churches here today and in this country. And it's not just minority churches, which I think is a really very important fact to bring in. What was the motive, and one of the primary motives that the shooter in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh gave for his crime? That the synagogue was involved in what kind of activity? Supporting refugees, bringing refugees over to the U.S. How many of our churches work with refugees or other, bring people in from overseas? How many of us do mission work in the third world? How many of us have churches that maybe rent out space to minority congregations, Korean congregations or others? So just because you're not a minority church doesn't mean you won't be targeted. We also saw a recent case in California where a guy was arrested, and he was looking at hitting churches because of their support for Israel. He was a white supremacist, but he was looking at hitting white churches because of their support for Israel. And many of our churches do pretty vocally support Israel, whether it's from the pulpit or other programs we have. So just because you're not in a minority church doesn't mean that you don't have to worry about the white hate threat and the way that it poses. Now, like the grassroots jihadists, basically we're looking at that leaderless resistance model. The grassroots guys, they don't have a lot of tradecraft. They're usually pretty sloppy. And they can usually be picked up if people are looking for them. The Atomwaffen guys, I think, are very troubling to me and disturbing, because in a lot of ways, the things that produced Atomwaffen were kind of a disgust within some of these young guns on the white hate side at the fact that a lot of the white supremacist movement wasn't doing much. They were talking a lot, they were meeting a lot, and maybe doing some protest, but they weren't doing a lot of attacks. And that was causing a lot of frustration for these younger radical guys. Say, hey, we got to do something. We have to do more than eat, meet, greet, and retreat. Okay, we got to kill people. We got to really make this change. We got to spark this racial holy war that we want to spark. So we've got to do something. And that's really where Atomwaffen is coming in. And they're just over the top violent. If you look at their ideology, if you look at their propaganda, I mean, it is all. It's not even trying to disguise any of the, a lot of kind of the more established white supremacists that want to be more mainstream, kind of try to play down all the Nazi stuff. No, these guys are like over the top with all the Nazi symbology, all the bloody symbology, really looking to create strife and looking to create attacks in bodies. So I think that's a real concern that we need to look at. And like I said, not just a threat to minority churches. Anarchists. Mostly where I'm seeing the anarchist attacks right now is kind of in south of here. So we've seen a number of anarchist attacks in Mexico where they have hit bombs, where they have bombed churches, also bombed offices and buildings associated with the church, primarily the Roman Catholic Church. And the anarchists are seeing the Catholic Church as being a symbol of oppression, and of course they also tie in the whole grievance of the sexual assault and everything. We've also seen churches targeted in places like Chile, Argentina, where there's been these anarchist groups that have, and usually it's property crime, some bombings, but we're also seeing this anarchist wave starting to spread a little bit in places like the UK, Italy, Germany. And so I'm concerned that we're going to see a little bit more of it upticking here in the U.S., especially when it comes not only to the anti-establishment kind of feeling of the anarchists, but they also have this kind of ideology that is against anything that is, I guess, holding the American culture together or Western culture together. So they see the church as one of the pillars that really needs to be attacked. Like the other actors we're talking about, usually because of their ideology, you don't see a lot of large anarchist organizations. It's kind of against their philosophy, but they do operate in, really the kind of lone wolves, or we see what they'll call these affinity groups or small cells that'll work together, and generally we'll see the bombings or arson. Pagans and Satanists. This is something that I think is starting to concern me, and something that's really got my attention lately that I think we need to worry about. We had that case in Louisiana earlier this year where we had I think it was the guy was a sheriff or a police chief, and his son was in this black metal band. And he started burning down churches. He burned down 3 churches down there. Initially, everybody thought that it was a white hate crime because he targeted predominantly black churches. And here it ended up that the reason that he was going after those churches because they tended to be made of wood instead of brick or stone. And he wanted to burn the churches that were going to make, do the most damage. And so that's why, and even in his own statements to online to kind of his constituency, he was bemoaning the fact that people thought it was a racially motivated thing. It was all anti-Christian. And the fact that this guy, first of all, is putting this stuff up online, communicating with other people of the same beliefs who were encouraging him, and kind of held those same beliefs, really leads me to believe we need to be concerned about these guys, and we need to be watching for them. Again, fortunately, they tend to work alone. They don't have a lot of terrorist tradecraft. So, if we're looking for them, we can see them as they're planning these attacks and before they conduct them. The problem is they're hitting soft targets generally where nobody is looking for them. I am concerned right now that there's not a lot of law enforcement attention being paid to these guys as far as an ideology. And so I'm concerned that they're kind of flying under the radar. And it's going to be one of these things that I believe we're going to see more of. We've also seen several attacks in Northern Europe associated with kind of these black metal Satanist people. Okay. Oh, wait. Went too far. Incels. This is another one that is kind of an emerging violent ideology. One that I'm concerned of could impact us in the church. We really haven't seen it impact a church yet. But I think that we could be ripe for some sort of an attack involving incels. The whole basis of their ideology is that they believe basically that women are evil, and they have a very distinct hatred towards women. And we've seen them attack. The Santa Barbara attack where they hit the school out there in California, going after kind of the co-eds. We've seen them hit a yoga studio in Florida. With an armed assault. Then we also saw an attack up in Canada with a vehicular assault by an incel. They believe that they've been, rejected, and therefore they need to lash out against society and the women that are oppressing them. They also, fortunately, tend to operate alone, although they have this, kind of online community that fosters everything. But the more I think about incels, and actually, just as a plug for Concilium there, Jonathan had done, and I believe it's in the sample, one of the samples he has out there on the table, he had done a couple months, what month was that, Jonathan? February? May. He had done, in May, he had done actually right up in the Concilium product that he's putting together for local churches, talking about kind of this emerging incel threat. But I certainly agree with his view on that when you think about the church and these incel guys are really into this pickup artist stuff, like that's on the internet, and you buy these books about 100 ways to pick up women or whatever, and it's all trashy stuff. Think about most of our nice Christian girls. Are they going to respond to those pickup approaches? No. They're going to tell these guys to pound salt, right? And so I'm concerned that due to these concentrations we have of nice girls that are going to be seen as rejecting these knuckleheads when they approach them, that we could see some sort of incel-related incident in our churches, whether it's singles groups, youth groups, women's Bible studies. So I'm really concerned. I think it's something that we need to look at, and I don't think, again, that a lot of attention is being paid right now to incels, which is really too bad.
I've never heard of incels. Does that stand for something?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It is involuntary celibate. So basically, they're upset that women won't have sex with them, and they in their mindset they basically believe that 10% of the men get 90% of the women, and then they blame their inability. Instead of being knuckleheads, they blame their inability on the women or on the guys that are having relations with all the women. And they call them Chads, or Stacys are the attractive women. And so they hate the Chads and they hate the Stacys. And those are the people that they're attacking. But there again, they want to blame everything on other people instead of themselves. And they don't get it. Yes?
Yeah, what do you think about the Antifa organization?
Well, they're anarchists.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I mean, so they fit in that category.
Well, no, yeah, Antifa would be an anarchist. Basically, what Antifa, which is the anti-fascist action, they're basically just one label that the anarchists put on themselves when they're in one form. So a lot of these same guys that you see going to these Antifa events are also the same ones that will go to these other anarchist, black bloc actions and such. So they're really all kind of put into that anarchist hat. All right, so as we look at all these various actors, and if there are any more questions, either stop me here or at the end. I'm going to save some time. And if I have time and you guys don't ask questions, I am going to start to do an interpretive dance. So please make sure that you, there you go, he's got the camera. That could be good blackmail. But anyway, so really what we're seeing is that almost all these actors we're talking about operate alone or in small groups. And there's an advantage in that. And in reality, what we saw with the white hate movement after the Fort Smith, Arkansas trial back in 1979, we saw them specifically move to this leaderless resistance model. And you can see that reflected in the fiction that the white supremacist movement wrote. Okay, one of the leaders of one of the predominant and most high-profile neo-Nazi organizations in the United States, the National Alliance, was this guy by the name of Dr. William Pierce. And under the pen name of Ian MacDonald, he wrote a book before the Fort Smith trial, and that one was called the Turner Diaries. You guys have heard of the Turner Diaries? Timmy McVeigh had a copy of it and used to sell it at gun shows. And in that model, he had this organization that was amazingly called the Order, that we later saw a real terrorist group calling itself the Order, trying to conduct those sorts of operations as a group. So we kind of had the Order there, working on, and that was kind of working under this hierarchical group type organization, an insurgent guerrilla group. But after Fort Smith trial, the white supremacist movement found that it was so infiltrated by federal law enforcement, local law enforcement, and groups like the ADL, SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, and others. They found that they were so inundated with informants that they couldn't pursue that kind of organizational model. Okay, they couldn't work as a group. They had to start adopting this leaderless resistance model. And so after that trial, we saw Pierce, there again under the Ian MacDonald pen name, he wrote a book by the name of Hunter, which is based on this idea of a lone wolf who is going out and shooting people. And actually, he dedicated that to this guy, Joseph Paul Franklin, who was a real lone wolf who went around and shot people. He shot people like Vernon Jordan, very high-profile, former cabinet member. He also shot Larry Flint, the publisher of Hustler. He killed a number of other people over this multi-year spree, and nobody understood that all these crimes were linked to this one guy. And so Pierce kind of came to that conclusion. We also saw Louis Roy Beam. He wrote a piece in the Seditionists that talked about the need to go to leaderless resistance. We saw people such as Tommy Metzger, of white Aryan resistance start talking about the need to go to lone wolf type activity as well. So all after the Fort Smith, we saw all the white supremacists going to that. At the same time, we saw the jihadists start to move to that in about 2009. They came to the same conclusion. We can't operate under this model of sending people to the U.S. to operate because we're getting busted. And so we saw groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, first in their Arabic language magazine, Sada al-Malahim, tell people just to start doing simple attacks. Use knives, clubs, guns, cars, whatever you can to kill people. Then after they had a couple successful, such as the Fort Hood attack, came out just right after that Sada al-Malahim article, and we had the Little Rock, Arkansas attack. They decided that they were going to get some traction with this approach in the United States. They launched an English language magazine called Inspire, which you guys have probably mostly heard of Inspire magazine, which basically was do-it-yourself operations to conduct terrorism within the United States. You know, build a bomb in the kitchen of your mom type stuff. So really the jihadists have modeled that. We've seen the anarchists and the far left use that for a long time. Earth Liberation Front is a perfect example of using leaderless resistance, where you had Craig Roseborough and those guys would provide kind of targeting information, and they would be kind of the above the board people that were providing the targets. Then you have these independent affinity groups and lone wolves running around bombing stuff and conducting arsons. So really all these actors here have this idea of operating under the leaderless resistance model because of basically the effectiveness of U.S. law enforcement. They can't operate as large organizations here. They need the OPSEC because they're getting busted. If they start communicating with people abroad or even within each other, they're getting busted. So they need to operate basically as small cells or individual units. The good news, again, they tend to possess very poor terrorism tradecraft. They are not very good at the things that makes you a good terrorist. And even going, if you think about it, even going to, think about even the U.S. military. I'm a former soldier. Just going to boot camp at Fort Leonard Wood, like I did in 1983, that would not have made me a real good insurgent guerrilla fighter. Okay, that's why they have this thing called the Q course, where they spend the special forces guys to basically give them the skills that they need to operate in that kind of environment under those kind of rules, away from the command, away from all your logistics and stuff. And so it's very difficult. It's much more difficult to operate in a hostile environment as a single guy, a lone wolf, or as a small cell than it is to be part of a unit where you have logistics, supply, command and control, all those sorts of things. And so it's really very difficult. One of the things that we've seen historically where these guys are really bad is when it comes, again, to surveillance. They all suck at surveillance. How many of you guys are cops that have had, or former agents that have done any surveillance training? It takes a long time to be good at surveillance, doesn't it? Think about the burn syndrome and how hard it is to overcome. I mean, in my prior life, we did hours and hours and hours, hundreds of hours of training, and then we would do drills, and on the you work the street, and you still get burn syndrome. And trying to work through that and behave naturally, surveillance is basically an unnatural activity. And so when your target looks at you or somebody looks at you, you have a tendency to react in unnatural ways. You kind of give yourself out by poor demeanor. And that's what we see a lot with these guys as they're planning the attacks. They have really bad demeanor, very, very poor surveillance skills, very little in the way of what we call status for action, cover for status, cover for action. They just don't do those things. They just tend to lurk. They tend to, videotape things, kind of like Mohammed Atta from the 9/11 attacks, going into Boston Logan Airport with a video camera and just taking video of the gate and security at the gate a couple months before the 9/11 attacks, so nobody picked up on it. But it was terrible in hindsight, but nobody was looking for it. And that's one of the things that we really need to look at. Also, they tend to attack soft targets. And that's one of the things we saw in that Pittsburgh example even just last month, right? That just the fact that mosque had physical security in place, that they had access control on the doors, and they had some CCTV cameras, was enough to scare that guy away from his targeting. And we've seen many other cases like that over the years where these lone wolf terrorists, if you will, or these lone operators, were scared away by decent security. Buford Furrow. I don't know, do you guys remember Buford Furrow back in '99? He was a guy that was former Aryan Nation security guard, and he went in and first shot up a Jewish daycare center in LA. And thank God the guy couldn't shoot. He emptied like 70 rounds out of an Uzi and didn't kill anybody in the daycare. That's like a miracle. And then he went and shot actually a Filipino postal worker and ended up getting convicted on that for the terrorism charges. But anyways, he went to 3 other Jewish targets before he chose that one and was scared away from the other targets due to good security. So what's that? What's the lesson there for our churches? Harden it up, unfortunately. Unlike these other threats that we're talking about, and statistically, I'll tell you what, Greg was right. You guys are 1,000 times more likely to have a sexual abuse type issue in your church than a terrorist attack. But still, unlike those threats, or unlike the threats of mentally disturbed individuals, unlike the fired employee, the aggrieved spouse, or even just the mentally disturbed individual, those things are generally coming from the inside. These are from the outside in. And because of that, they need to conduct surveillance before they can hit your facility. And it's really important that we dedicate some resources to looking for that surveillance, because they need to conduct it. How many of you guys have done, former law enforcement, have done search warrants? Would you ever go, or an arrest warrant, would you ever go do an arrest warrant on a high threat type person, or a search warrant without actually having eyes on the building? Okay, I mean, yeah, Google Earth is pretty cool, right? You can find a lot of stuff online, but would you ever go hit that house without having eyes on first? No, of course not. It's the same thing for these guys. They've got to go, they're going to be looking at the target, they're going to be looking for security measures, what they can quantify. Usually pretty sloppily. But the surveillance is really the key as we start looking at their attack cycle. And this is there again, I'm almost feel like I'm following in Greg's shadow in a lot of ways here. But this is really understanding how they operate, understanding that attack cycle, and the vulnerabilities of the attack cycle is really the key. And the one that we really want to focus on the most, because it's where they're the most vulnerable, is that surveillance phase. Yes, sir?
Have you found that drones are playing a more important part in either the surveillance part of it or delivering possible explosive devices?
On the drone threat, it is something to be aware of. I know I'm talking mostly to my corporate clients about that, and of course also the high-value targets. So the high-profile, protectees at their homes, where you have kind of paparazzi type interest in what they're doing, or the R&D facilities where you're worried about corporate espionage. But certainly those are a tool that can be used. The other thing that we're concerned about are things like game cameras or other remote cameras that now everything hooks on the cell or the internet, that you can put in place to kind of watch the activities at a site. So one of the things that we are talking to people about is not only to be aware of those drones that are operating in your area, but also to be looking for the cameras. And a lot of times they'll stick those on a tree. And we have seen cases, specifically cases in this country, of people that we believe were terrorists that had planted game camera type things near high-value targets. We've actually seen that done. So it is a very real concern. It's a real tactic that's out there. But certainly, there again, it's a tool, but they're not going to just use a drone. That's going to be, they're going to also do physical surveillance at the same time. But anyway, so really, and as one of the, I really like the Texas state, when we talk about the active shooter approach with the avoid, deny, defend. I think that's better than run, hide, fight, just because I like this idea of avoiding instead of running. You want to know where you're running. But I like then to take that when we're looking at protecting our facilities, and specifically, houses of worship here. I like to take that and kind of take that avoid to prevent, because I really want to try to keep us left of the boom as much as possible. Okay, our active shooter training stuff, our reactive measures, and whether that's armed security or whatever else your church does, that stuff's all good. Access controls, that's all good. It's all helpful, but it's really not enough. You really need to be preventative. You really need to be, thinking of that in terms of this attack cycle and nipping it in the bud. Because let's face it, once that gun comes out and he starts shooting, you can't put those bullets back in the gun. You may be able to take him down, but those bullets that he's already fired are gone. You can't control that. So what we want to do is get him before he draws. We want to get him before he can launch that attack and be preemptive. And so that's why I really have this emphasis on the prevent. Because once it gets to that stage, it's too late. And one of the ways that I think is critically important is your teams specifically need to be trained on what to look for. I would even run some exercises, have some offenders come in, pretend offenders come in, conduct some surveillance, see what your guys are seeing in the parking lot, and really, since that threat's emanating from outside, it's super important to have eyes in the parking lot, because that's where it's going to come from. And that's what we're seeing. Obviously, trying to control your access points as much as you can. And it doesn't have to be antithetical to good ministry, though, either. I mean, situational awareness, one of the things that I found over my years working, whether domestically or overseas, having good situational awareness and your security team having good situational awareness not only lets you see problems as they're coming, but it also allows you to see ministry opportunities. You see people who are hurting, you see people who are crushed, and sometimes it lets you interact with people and meet them where there's a need. So, just by thinking, well, yeah, if we pay it doesn't mean being paranoid. It doesn't mean jacking people up all the time. But, just going over and talking to people, how you doing, what's up? You look like you're kind of down today. And just even having those kind of interactions, if somebody is a bad guy planning something, they're at least saying, well, hey, somebody's paying attention to me. This might not be good. This isn't a soft target. But it could also give you an opportunity, if it is somebody who's not bad, to maybe minister to them and meet their needs.
Scott?
Yes?
Hey, how common is it today with these groups you mentioned for them to do dry runs after the planning phase and prior to the attack?
We are definitely, I mentioned Atta from the 9/11 attacks. They did dry runs on those flights. They hit those airports. They will go and even if they don't have the bombs made yet, a lot of times they will walk into these facilities. Even another good example of a dry run was Dylan Roof in South Carolina, the church shooter. So, I mean, they will go and they will check out they will check out your access. They will check out your access controls. They will kind of probe first before they launch the attacks. And of course, that's when we want to spot them, or at least deter them if we can. I mean, obviously, it's better to hopefully spot, report, and get them jacked up before they hurt somebody else. Nothing against, the Methodists down the street or whoever. We don't want them hitting them either, or the synagogue or anybody. If we can get them off the street, we want that. So prevent, deny is the next thing. Access controls do work. In addition to that Pittsburgh case I was talking about last month, there was a school shooting in Philadelphia that was averted. It was the day after Parkland in Florida. And there was a young guy went up to a door of a school in Philly, pulled out a gun and started to open it. He couldn't get in the door. Have any of you guys seen that video? That's an awesome video. He puts his gun back in his pocket and walks away. It works. I mean, so by denying them access to your facilities, it can really, and what does that mean? Limiting your number of exits or entrances, and then obviously we don't want to limit exits for fire, but the entrances that can be used, during a service, having your people there as greeters, as parking lot attendants. There's a lot of things that we can do as security to make people feel welcome too. But by keeping them out, I mean, now I have a small church. We're Lion Bible Church in Guys Mills, Pennsylvania. We just basically lock the doors once service gets underway. Have the greeters, they sit towards the back. If anybody knocks, we can go open the door. But we want to make sure that we don't let people just come in. Yes, sir.
I'm getting a lot of pushback on the idea of locking the doors during service. They don't want to leave the church locked up. It should be open.
It's crazy not to.
Say, well, that's crazy.
Well, and that's where I think education is important. I think you really need to educate them. And obviously, I mean, you don't want to be locked down where nobody can get in. Hopefully you have somebody that can respond and open the door if somebody's coming in late, which is usually my daughter-in-law and grandson. If he's having a bad morning, yeah, she's going to be late. My son plays with me on the worship team, so he's always there way early. And so his wife's the one that's coming in late. Yes?
I'd just like to respond to that. We have the same problem, and the way we solved it was we locked most of the doors, but we left two that were accessible from the outside, but those doors are under direct observation with people with radios.
There you go.
So if they see somebody coming that's an obvious threat, they can immediately notify us and we can respond.
Yeah, another thing that's very effective in those situations are mag locks. And we use those a lot in embassy applications. And they're basically a magnetic lock where you hit the button and it just clamps it down. And so we would use those a lot in our lobby area, not only at our hard line, so it's to keep people from the lobby of getting into the hard line, but also we could mag lock the exterior door, so we could kind of trap people in the lobby if we needed to, if there was an issue, or keep people outside just by punching the mag lock. And those aren't all that massively expensive. They're usually pretty reasonable. But there's something that you can lock down pretty quick, and you can do it remotely. And so if there is an issue, you can pop the button, lock the door if you see it coming, and keep them out. Definitely, in my church there again, we're small, but we have the ability to pull down shades within the classroom areas for the kids. We have good locks and good doors on the nursery area to protect there. So you want to deny them that access. And you know what? Out of all these shootings that we've seen, and globally, most of these active shooters do not bring in the tools necessary to breach doors. The only incident that I'm aware of where we've seen kind of an armed assault where the shooters have tried to breach doors was in Mumbai back in 2009. And those guys tried to kick some doors and actually they hurt themselves and kind of stopped. But the people that opened the doors then obviously died. But a lot of the people that barricaded themselves into their rooms, they survived. Places like Ouagadougou, those people survived by locking themselves. That was an armed assault by Al-Qaeda. They survived that hotel assault by locking themselves in their rooms. We've seen many other cases where people have survived by denying. Yes, sir?
I'd like to disagree with you a little bit on that. Sandy Hook, the door was locked. He merely stepped to the side, fired a couple of rounds through a plate glass window, and walked through.
Well, that was not good security.
Yeah, but
yes.
What I'm saying is just locking the door, he didn't necessarily turn around and walk away.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a bad design there.
Which a lot of churches and buildings have that design. You've got a door with large.
Yeah, that's not a good design. And of course, I mean, the other thing is, obviously, while you're giving your people your active shooter training, you need to also, teach them the difference between cover and concealment. Because most of these buildings today, all this looks pretty solid, but a lot of the buildings today you can shoot right through the walls. There's no cover there. And then obviously the defend part, which is where you guys and your team come. That's about the most vicious looking sheepdogs I could find for the slide. I should have pictures of some of you guys. You're looking pretty vicious. But anyways, I've left open some time for questions. So any questions kind of about the ideologies I'm talking about, these threats, terrorist tradecraft? Yes, sir.
Can you differentiate between the
Atomwaffen
and the Anarchists? They seem kind of close.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no. Basically, anarchists are far leftists. Okay, the anarchists, believe it or not, they were terrorists before anybody else. They evolved during Victorian times. And they had split off from the communists like in the 1880s. And believe it or not, they conducted the first VBID attack in the United States when they did a wagon attack on Wall Street with a horse-drawn wagon. They assassinated a president. They've assassinated heads of state overseas. This was back in the 1800s, early 1900s. But the anarchists are still around, believe it or not. And it's a very old ideology that is, very violent. They believe in the need to violently overthrow the government. So they're left-wing. Whereas the Atomwaffen guys, they're white supremacists, and they're fascists. They're right-wing. So they also are kind of anarchic in a way, but they want to establish their order. So they want kind of a fascist, white-led America where they get rid of all the minorities. They want to clear all the minorities out of Europe into the traditional, what they consider traditional white areas or homelands. And so they're both kind of anarchic, but they come from very different ideological backgrounds. One of the things with the anarchists that's interesting, and that whole left wing, is that they are very intertwined. So the animal rights, earth liberation type people, black bloc people, save the whales, they will all kind of go to each other's demonstrations, date each other's girlfriends. It's all very very intertwined. So hey, if you go to my Save the Whales demonstration next month, I'll go to your whatever no chop down the trees this week. So they're just very intertwined on the left there. You see a lot of that going on. And then they're also very intertwined kind of also globally. So we'll see anarchists in Chile conducting attacks in the name of an imprisoned Greek terrorist, or vice versa. So, but that's mostly because of the internet stuff. But Greece, Italy, up into the U.S., Canada, and Latin America, there's still a lot of anarchists out there. And actually, we just had the Antifa guy who was, just a week and a half ago, tried to hit the immigration center out in Washington State.
Not very successful.
In Tacoma. No, well, he had burned at least one vehicle, but fortunately, he didn't hurt anybody. A question, sir?
Is there any national notification system aside from media for any rising threat levels? Accounts to follow or anything like that?
Follow my Twitter account. But there are some pretty good people that I follow out there as far as, obviously, DHS type stuff, you want to follow them, FBI. I also follow the guys from like the Anti-Defamation League to keep, or like Mark Pitcavage. I don't know if you guys know Mark. He's the guy that started Militia Watchdog like way back in the 80s. He's a real solid guy. I talk to him all the time on Twitter. So they're really good on kind of white hate type stuff.
Scott, what about InfraGards?
Yeah, well, InfraGards hit and miss, but they're there, and it depends on which chapter you're dealing with.
The national information notifications.
There's also the Secure Community Network. Quite frankly, the Jewish world's way ahead of us on most of this stuff. But SCN, the Secure Community Network, is really good. You can sign up for their newsletters. I get their newsletters every day because it gives me a nice, kind of daily feed on what's going on with anti-Semitism across the globe. And a lot of that can have some impact, into us as well, as evangelicals. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did you define burn syndrome like you were talking
Oh,
about?
okay. Yeah, burn syndrome, it's when you're conducting surveillance and you're watching the rabbit, the person you're following, if that person pays attention to you or watches you, you have this feeling that they have seen you and made you for who you are. So, for example, I was working a case on a Jamaican doper who had committed passport fraud. And I had surveilled him for a couple weeks because I wanted to get a good handle on what he was doing. And we're going to launch this big operation to grab he and his wife. And there were several times when I was conducting surveillance on him that I was certain he had seen me. I was dead sure that he had burned me. But when I showed up, locked the cuffs on him, he had no idea who I was. And so that just shows, the power of that feeling, because it really is an unnatural feeling when you're conducting surveillance. Oh, yes, sir.
Are there any good, I'll say, online sites for surveillance? I've looked at the one the federal government's got, like Watch and Observe. It's milquetoast at best. Are there any other good training sites or anything you can pick up online for this?
Look at some of the stuff. I don't want to sound self-serving, but probably if you just search my name and surveillance or detecting surveillance, there's stuff all over the web that Fred Burton and I have written for years. Just on really detecting terrorist surveillance, what criminal surveillance looks like, and quite frankly, when we're looking at the level of these people and their ability, it's really not much different from most criminals. And you guys, at least you that have been in law enforcement, you guys have seen criminal surveillance. For the most part, it's not real good. You have some high-level criminals who might have some decent tradecraft. But they're going to be like at the high-end guys that are doing, big-time jewel heists and stuff. Most criminals just aren't very good at surveillance because they're not trained, and it just takes a long time to get that skill set down. Anybody else?
All right, thanks, Scott.